Here we go. Right. How very exciting is this? This is the first episode of the daily medieval podcast. I've got the name then. Which is very exciting to do. I've been wanting to do something like this for a long time, and I'm really excited that I finally get the opportunity to do this, and I hope that it yields such great things. I'm just very, very excited. The way that this channel will be laid out is kind of three main things. First is kind of this, really, which is the podcast, the main kind of aspect of the channel, which is, about kind of learning history, learning medieval history, absorbing that information, kind of talking about some really interesting things, like today, which is about English imperialism. I keep looking over, by the way, because I have in front of me some notes that I've come prepared for such an occasion. So that's the main thing, is the podcast. The other things will be about my adventures of the wonderful sport Bowhurt, IMCF, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have. Essentially, in a way, it's medieval combat, not reenactment. But that's kind of a really interesting thing as well as a sport, and it's based off of medieval manuscripts and armor and weaponry, so it's really interesting nevertheless. And then the third and final thing is basically, I guess, me as a person, really, in some sort of narcissistic way, because I am currently doing my masters. I'm about halfway through of my masters in medieval history, and I'd like a career as a historian, whichever form that may be. And so I think it'd be really interesting to show my journey over time, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in a sense, of what is what is me as a historian, and I hope that also is interesting in a way, to talk about those things, and me as a person, and the things I love, the shows I love. I'm getting off track. Anywho, but so to begin with, we are talking about English imperialism, mainly that which has been described by the amazing and wonderful John Gillingham. He is the rock star of medieval history, and I would highly recommend reading this. I will put not links, but I will put in the description titles of the various works that I am referencing in this, and mostly based on John's work, but there are a couple of other contemporary sources and other things that you may find interesting. Nevertheless, let us get right into it, because we're talking about a very interesting topic, that is English imperialism. Now, such a topic has been bombarded with scholarship and from all sorts of different, schools of academia, but most of them focus on the modern era or the early modern era. Basically, imperialism, what we mean by imperialism, is that kind of social Darwinism, the superiority complex, in a way, that you as a nation are better than someone else or the nations around you, etc., etc. But this is a very modern term. I remember using such terminology in when I did modern history at school. You wouldn't necessarily think, however, that its origins are in the medieval era, but they are. And this is what we're going to look at today, is basically the story of medieval English imperialism. But where does this story begin? Well, in the way that we have BC and AD, and the birth of Christ. This birth of Christ is 1066. What a strange metaphor, but there we go. 1066 is our kind of period of like the before and the after. The reason I say this is because what we will come to find out is that culture is integral to English imperialism. Before 1066, you have a kind of affiliation between the Celtic nations and England, one which is similar in many different ways, from the laws, from the type of warfare, from, religious and faith and devotion, as well as economies and all sorts of affiliations that are happening. 1066 occurs. William the Conqueror comes over, dominates England, imposes through basically the introduction of the French noble class, French values. Now, what I mean by French is actually Norman values in a way, Norman culture. And this is where English imperialism begins. Now, essentially, what we find is that what becomes evident by the 12th century, once Norman culture has firmly established itself, once French has become the lingua franca and the noble class indulge in the decadence of Versailles and all this, la-di-da, is that you get then a firm distinction between the culture of England and the culture of the Celtic nations that previously had not been seen. And there are some beautiful contemporary sources that essentially kind of highlight this idea. One of which most famously in a sense is the Gesta Stephani. Now this describes England as the seat of justice, the abode of peace, the aspect of piety. However, Wales, on the other hand, is described as the country of woodland and pasture. So, I mean, from that already, you can see a kind of disparity emerging. I mean, these are sources from the 12th century, but this is not a sole source. This is almost common, not common knowledge, but commonly accepted as a cultural attitude. That England is more advanced in a sense. William of Malmesbury, the historian, the beloved historian of the 12th century, describes also disparities. He says, and I turn the page, he talks about what is the nationibus barbaris, the barbarians. Now, barbarians, obviously, when you think of history and you think of barbarians, you think of Rome, and that's where barbarians, in a terminology sense, come from. In this period, however, there's a slight difference in the definition. Barbarians in the Roman era kind of meant pagan. So obviously, when you think of Gaul and or even Scotland in a way, like the proto-Celtic tribes that were in Scotland, these were barbarians because they were pagans. They were, dirty pagans. In this period, however, because of Christianity, obviously the Celtic nations and England are both Christian, but it is then culture that distinguishes them and separates them, which is why barbarians are used in this sense. So, William of Malmesbury describes various nations as the nationibus barbaris, namely Wales, Scotland, Denmark, and Norway, also Ireland. So it's interesting that there's kind of, in a sense, this fascination of the classical world is where these kind of attributes arise, these notions of barbarianism, and kind of this social Darwinism arise from a combination of culture kind of influenced by classical attitudes. So the question is, however, we've got these sources that tell us, these dirty Celts, but what actually is the evidence as to why these notions came about? And there's three distinct areas that kind of are like groups, I guess, within contemporary sources that show kind of this disparity, this cultural disparity between England and the rest of the British Isles. The first of which is economics. Basically, when we look at sources written by Gerald of Wales, especially his descriptions of Ireland, basically we see what is a relaxed and slothful devotion of barbarians. Apparently they are just absolutely lazy. But the reason for this comes down to, again, another classical attribute of barbarianism. In the classical world, it was seen that pastoral agriculture could not uphold civilization. Now, what were the economies of the Celtic world? Pastoral agriculture. So it was seen that basically, whilst England had villages and towns and coin production and Jewish settlement and kind of a bustling centralized economy, the Celts were broken up into clans, families. When you think of that, my favourite show, Outlander, when you think of the Highlands of Scotland, how you have the different clans and how they interact, and it's very, decentralized. So again, you can see the differences between that. But the main thing is, however, this idea of pastoral agriculture, that the Celtic nations, the foundation of their society was the agriculture of animals, essentially. Another thing that separates them is their attitudes to slavery, quite interestingly, because England, in England, slavery was pretty much dead by the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. However, it endured in the Celtic nations, which prompted notions of inhumane institutions and this idea of barbarity, that these were, not God's chosen people in a way. Next, of course, so that's economics. This idea of this economic and in a sense technological disparity between these two nations. The next of which is military. Again, it's not obviously it's not based in the medieval era, but I will use Outlander again. I'm absolutely indulged in Outlander at the moment. I absolutely love it. But on one hand, it kind of does show this kind of disparity in a sense, because you've got the redcoats of, the British Empire, and then you've got these, you've got the Highlanders, your Frasers and your Mackenzies. I can't believe I just did that. That are kind of, these raiding tactics, kind of this guerrilla warfare that has been seen in history throughout history, even up until, today's world, where you see the American army in Vietnam or in the Gulf War, when you see this kind of guerrilla tactics versus a mobilized standing army, is essentially what England saw themselves in the medieval era against the Celtic nations. They saw themselves as tactically advanced. They were able to build castles. They had highly controlled power and politics. They had hierarchies of soldiers, ranks, all this sort of stuff. Whereas these dirty Celts had raiding tactics, warfare against non-combatants, the slaughtering and butchery of nobles, which, of course, when we look at England adopted chivalry and adopted this notion that you would ransom nobles rather than slaughter them. And so it was just seen as an abomination. And we see this written by Gerald of Wales, where he describes the difference between French and Celtic warfare as such. The French ransom, the Irish butcher. And this is essentially, again, that cultural difference, this idea of chivalry that once again distinguishes England from the Celtic nations, which is why they saw themselves as being so much more advanced and I guess, better, really, than the Celtic nations. So we have economics, we have military. The third and final thing that distinguished these two nations is marriage custom. Again, I guess this kind of shows again that imperialism, rather than, it kind of shocked me to understand that imperialism although ideological, did not arise from politics or like the notions of this like great man theory kind of, when you look at like Hitler and stuff, but actually it was cultural attitudes that distinguished and that emerged, that imperialism emerged from, because marriage customs play a great role in, again, distinguishing these two cultures, mainly because England, when we look at England, marriage was under church law. You could only get married once. It was permanent. It was monogamous. One wife, yours forever until the day you die. And you could not marry within 6 degrees of kinship. The Celtic nations, however, had very different marriage customs. Mainly because they were based on ancient and traditional laws. So what did this mean? This means that you could have multiple wives, which then means you could have multiple sons, which then means that there was a lot of succession issues because there was just so many sons competing for what was partable inheritance, that was equal inheritance among the sons, whilst England retained primogeniture, which was kind of where your first son would get the majority, let's say like 75% of your land and titles, and then it was divided equally amongst the successive sons, which then meant that you didn't have as many succession disputes, basically. But back to the marriage customs. So you could have multiple wives, you could divorce, you could remarry, you could do all these things. There was little distinction between illegitimate and legitimate children. You could, if you really wanted to, commit a form of incest. You could marry within 6 degrees of kinship, which you could not do in England. And so you see, in contemporary sources, this kind of denouncement of the Celtic nations because of the way in which they can marry. We have here as well, according to Richard of Hexham, the Scots were bestial men who think nothing of committing incest, adultery, and other abominations. Gerald of Wales also in his texts on Ireland equally discusses this idea of bestiality and incest and these dirty things that the Celtic nations are doing. So we see that, I guess, that these ideas, these ideas of imperialism are steeped in a degree of truth, in that there were cultural, economic, military differences that distinguished England from the Celtic nations, which emerged from French culture. Ideas of chivalry, ideas of production and economy, centralization, etc., which were not evident in the Celtic nations. And it is here, essentially, that imperialism was birthed and would emerge later into, the later eras that we see in the amazing show Outlander. Absolutely love it. And then later on into the 20th and, I guess even the 21st century, arguably, so that was, I'd say it is a really interesting topic to look at, because it's something that obviously is discussed in great detail in the early modern period, but do we understand the origins? Well, I certainly didn't know, but and I don't think many people do know where ideas of English imperialism come from, and the idea that it emerged from French culture, is something, I guess, nuanced in itself. And so thank you very much for listening, and I do hope that you enjoyed it, and do give feedback, be it positive or negative, just not too negative. And be sure to tune in, subscribe, do all that stuff to future videos, and we shall see how this goes. But thank you very much. Do spread the word, I guess. and see you next time.